What if I told you that somewhere out there, there might be an exact copy of you walking around living a completely different life? What if that copy wasn't just similar, but identical down to every last detail? Today we're diving into 5 true encounters with doppelgangers that will make you question everything you think you know about identity and reality itself. But before we begin, I need to warn you. These aren't just stories about people who happen to look alike. These are accounts of individuals who came face to face with what appeared to be perfect duplicates of themselves or others, often in circumstances that defy all logical explanation. If you're easily unsettled, you might want to turn back now. For everyone else, let's explore the darkest corners of human experience together. The term doppelganger comes from German folklore, literally meaning double walker. Throughout history, seeing your doppelganger was considered an omen of death or misfortune. While modern science might explain some of these encounters through psychological phenomena or mere coincidence, the stories you're about to hear will challenge even the most skeptical minds. Our first story takes us to a small college town in Ohio, where Sarah Mitchell was completing her final semester of nursing school. Sarah was known for her distinctive appearance, vibrant red hair that cascaded past her shoulders, a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident, and a unique birthmark on her neck shaped like a crescent moon. These weren't features you'd easily mistake or forget. One Thursday evening in October, Sarah was working the late shift at the campus library, something she did twice a week to earn extra money. The library was nearly empty, except for a few students cramming for midterms in the far corners. Around 11:30, Sarah decided to take a break and stepped outside for some fresh air. The campus was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of autumn leaves. As she walked around the building's perimeter, Sarah noticed someone sitting on a bench about 50 feet away. The figure was partially obscured by shadows, but something about the silhouette seemed familiar. Curious, Sarah moved closer, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Sitting on that bench was herself, not someone who resembled her, not a distant relative or lookalike, but an exact duplicate down to the same clothes she was wearing that night. The other Sarah sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with an expression Sarah had never seen on her own face, a blank, almost vacant look that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Sarah tried to call out, but her voice caught in her throat. She took another step forward, and that's when the other Sarah slowly turned her head. Their eyes met, and Sarah felt a chill that seemed to penetrate her very soul. The doppelganger's eyes were her eyes, the same shade of green with tiny flecks of gold, but they held something different, something that felt ancient and knowing. For what felt like an eternity, they stared at each other in complete silence. Then, without warning, the other Sarah smiled. It wasn't Sarah's smile though. It was wrong somehow, too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Sarah blinked, and in that split second, the figure vanished. Not walked away, not ran off, but simply disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. Shaken but trying to rationalize the experience, Sarah returned to the library and attempted to continue her work. However, for the remainder of her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every reflection in the computer monitors seemed to hold potential menace, every shadow appeared to hide a duplicate of herself. The next morning, Sarah's roommate Jenny mentioned something that made Sarah's blood run cold all over again. Jenny had been at a party across town the previous night and swore she had seen Sarah there around midnight, the exact time Sarah had encountered her doppelganger. According to Jenny, Sarah had been standing in the corner of the party, not talking to anyone, just watching the crowd with that same vacant expression Sarah had witnessed on the bench. When Jenny had approached to say hello, the figure had turned and walked away without acknowledgement, disappearing into the crowd. Jenny had assumed Sarah was upset about something and had decided to give her space. But Sarah had never been to that party. She had been at the library the entire night with security cameras and timestamps to prove it. Our second encounter takes us across the country to Portland, Oregon, where where Michael Chen worked as a graphic designer for a mid-sized advertising agency. Michael was a creature of habit, taking the same bus route to work every morning at exactly 7:45. He was the type of person who noticed patterns and details, which made what happened to him all the more disturbing. One rainy Tuesday morning in March, Michael was running about 10 minutes late due to a delayed bus. As he hurried down the sidewalk toward his office building, he spotted someone walking about a block ahead of him. The figure had the same gait, the same posture, even the same distinctive gray jacket that Michael was wearing that day. Curious about the coincidence, Michael quickened his pace to get a better look. As he drew closer, Michael's confusion turned to disbelief. The person ahead of him wasn't just wearing similar clothes, they were identical. Same height, same build, same dark hair styled in the exact same way. Even more unsettling, the figure was carrying the same leather messenger bag that Michael's girlfriend had given him for his birthday, complete with a small tear near the bottom strap that Michael had been meaning to repair. Michael called out, thinking perhaps it was some elaborate joke orchestrated by his co-workers, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned a corner and headed toward Michael's office building. Michael broke into a run, determined to solve this mystery, but when he rounded the corner, the sidewalk was empty. The figure had vanished completely. Confused but not yet truly alarmed, Michael continued to his office. When he arrived, his colleague Lisa immediately commented on how early he was today. According to Lisa, she had seen Michael arrive nearly an hour ago and head straight to his desk without his usual morning greeting. This made no sense to Michael, who had time-stamped receipts from his coffee shop and bus ticket to prove he had been elsewhere. Michael went to his desk and found his computer already logged in, which was impossible since he always shut it down completely before leaving each evening. More disturbing still, there was a new design file open on his desktop, a project he had been struggling with for weeks. The design was complete, and it was exactly what Michael had been envisioning, but couldn't quite execute. The file showed it had been created that morning at 7:15, when Michael was still at home getting ready. Throughout the day, Michael received comments from various colleagues about his unusual behavior that morning. According to them, he had been working at his desk but hadn't responded to greetings or questions. He had simply sat there typing away with an intensity and focus that seemed almost mechanical. When the office manager had tried to discuss a deadline with him, he had looked up with what she described as completely blank eyes before returning to his work without saying a word. Security footage later confirmed that someone who looked exactly like Michael had indeed entered the building using Michael's keycard at 7:20 that morning. The figure moved through the hallways with purpose, heading directly to Michael's desk as if intimately familiar with the layout. However, the camera angles never captured a clear view of the face, and the footage seemed to have several unexplained gaps during crucial moments. The most chilling aspect of this encounter was what Michael discovered when he examined the completed design more closely. Hidden within the graphics, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were subtle alterations that spelled out a message. When Michael isolated these elements, they formed words that made his skin crawl. "I am becoming you." Our third story brings us to the suburbs of Atlanta, where Rebecca Torres lived alone in a small house she had inherited from her grandmother. Rebecca worked night shifts as an emergency dispatcher, which meant she was often home alone during the day, sleeping or preparing for her evening shift. She was used to solitude and had never felt unsafe in her quiet neighborhood until the day she met herself. It was a warm afternoon in June, and Rebecca had just woken up from her post-shift sleep. She was moving through her daily routine, making coffee and checking her phone, when she heard the sound of her own laughter coming from the backyard. Not similar laughter, but her exact laugh, the one with the distinctive snort at the end that had embarrassed her since childhood. Confused, Rebecca looked out her kitchen window and saw someone in her backyard, tending to the small garden her grandmother had planted years ago. The figure was kneeling among the tomato plants wearing Rebecca's favorite sundress, the blue one with tiny white flowers that she had been planning to put on after her coffee. But Rebecca was still in her pajamas, and that dress was hanging in her bedroom closet. As Rebecca watched in stunned silence, the figure in her garden began to hum a song that Rebecca had been obsessed with lately, an obscure indie track that she had discovered just weeks ago and played repeatedly while getting ready for work. The humming was perfect, matching every note and inflection exactly as Rebecca would have done it. The figure stood up and turned toward the house, and Rebecca found herself staring at her own face. But this version of herself looked somehow more content, more at peace than Rebecca had felt in years. The doppelganger's skin had a healthy glow, her hair fell in perfect waves, and she moved with a grace that Rebecca had always wished she possessed. Rebecca watched as her duplicate continued working in the garden, occasionally pausing to smell the flowers or to examine the growing vegetables with obvious pleasure. It was like watching an idealized version of herself, the person she might have been if she had made different choices or lived a different life. Unable to contain her shock any longer, Rebecca rushed outside to confront this impossible situation, but as soon as she opened the back door, the figure looked up with a gentle smile and simply faded away like morning mist. The garden showed no signs of recent activity, no footprints in the soft soil, no disturbed plants where the figure had been kneeling. However, Rebecca noticed something that made her question her own sanity. The garden looked better than it had in months. Plants that had been struggling were now thriving, weeds that had been choking the flowers were gone, and everything had been watered and cared for with obvious expertise. Rebecca had been neglecting the garden for weeks due to her demanding work schedule, yet here it was, more beautiful than ever. Over the following days, Rebecca began to notice other small changes around her house. Dishes she had left in the sink were cleaned and put away. Laundry she had been putting off was washed, folded, and organized in her drawers. Her refrigerator was stocked with healthy foods she didn't remember buying, and her bills were filed and organized in a way she had never managed to achieve. Most unsettling of all, Rebecca began receiving compliments from neighbors about how well she was maintaining her grandmother's garden, and how healthy and happy she looked lately. According to them, they had seen her working outside during the day, always smiling and waving when they passed by. But Rebecca worked nights and slept during the day. She was never outside during those hours, and she certainly hadn't been feeling particularly happy or healthy lately. Our fourth encounter takes us to a remote cabin in the mountains of Colorado, where David Park had gone for a solo hiking and photography retreat. David was an experienced outdoorsman who had spent countless weekends in the wilderness, so he was comfortable with solitude and the sounds of nature. What he wasn't prepared for was encountering another version of himself in one of the most isolated places he had ever visited. David had been at the cabin for 3 days, enjoying the peace and quiet while working on a photography project, documenting the changing seasons in the high country. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a challenging hiking trail that David had needed 2 trips to navigate with all his equipment. On his 4th morning, David woke before dawn to capture the sunrise from a nearby ridge. He packed his camera gear and began the steep climb in the pre-dawn darkness, using a headlamp to navigate the rocky terrain. As he reached his planned vantage point, David noticed another light moving through the valley below, someone else with a headlamp walking along the same trail he had used to reach the cabin. This was unusual because David hadn't seen any other vehicles at the trailhead, and the remote location meant that encountering other hikers was extremely rare. Curious about who else might be in the area, David adjusted his telephoto lens and focused on the distant figure. What he saw through his viewfinder made him nearly drop his expensive camera. The figure below was carrying the same model of camera bag that David used, moving with the same careful, measured pace that David employed when navigating difficult terrain in low light. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the way the person moved, the particular angle of the shoulders, the slight favoring of the left leg that David had developed after an old hiking injury. As the sun began to rise, providing more natural light, David was able to see more details. The figure was wearing clothing identical to what David had on, the same hiking boots, the same olive green jacket, even the same red bandana that David always kept tied to his backpack. But David was on the ridge, watching this person in the valley below. The figure stopped at the exact spot where David had taken several photographs the day before, set up a tripod in precisely the same position David had used, and began taking pictures of the sunrise. David watched in fascination and growing unease as his doppelganger captured the same shots from the same angles with the same methodical approach David always used. What happened next defied all explanation. The figure below suddenly looked up toward David's position on the ridge, raised one hand in a casual wave, and then shouldered his equipment and walked back toward the cabin. David had been at least half a mile away and partially concealed behind rocks, yet somehow the other person had known exactly where to look. When David returned to the cabin several hours later, he found evidence that someone had been there in his absence. His laptop was open and displaying photos that David didn't remember, taking images of himself sleeping in the cabin's small bedroom, taken from angles that would have been impossible for David to achieve alone. The photos were time-stamped from the previous night when David had been alone in the cabin with no one else for miles around. Most disturbing of all, David discovered a note written in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it. The note simply said, "The mountains remember everything. Some reflections cast shadows. You are not alone here, and you never have been." Our final encounter brings us to the bustling city of Chicago, where Amanda Wells worked as a legal secretary in a downtown law firm. Amanda's story is perhaps the most unsettling because it involves not just a single sighting, but an ongoing presence that seemed to be actively living a parallel version of her life. Amanda first became aware of her doppelganger through a series of confused encounters with people who knew her. It started small, with cashiers at her regular coffee shop thanking her for her generous tip the day before, when Amanda distinctly remembered receiving poor service and leaving only standard gratuity. Then her dry cleaner mentioned how much they had enjoyed chatting with her about her recent vacation to Italy, a trip Amanda had never taken and honestly couldn't afford. These incidents might have been dismissed as cases of mistaken identity, but they kept happening with people who knew Amanda well. Her neighbor across the hall mentioned seeing her come home with grocery bags the previous evening, when Amanda had actually worked late and ordered takeout to her office. The doorman at her building commented on how cheerful she had seemed that morning, despite the fact that Amanda had been fighting a terrible headache and barely managed to mumble a greeting. The situation escalated when Amanda's best friend Claire called to confront her about being ignored at a restaurant downtown. According to Claire, she had clearly seen Amanda sitting alone at a corner table, reading a book that Claire recognized as one of Amanda's favorites. When Claire had approached to say hello, Amanda had looked up with what Claire described as a cold, distant expression before gathering her things and leaving without a word. Amanda had been at home sick with food poisoning that entire day, with delivery receipts and a concerned call from her mother to prove it. Yet Claire insisted she had seen Amanda at the restaurant, wearing a dress that Amanda recognized as hanging in her own closet. The encounters became more frequent and more detailed. Amanda's co-workers began commenting on conversations they had supposedly had with her in locations where Amanda had never been. Her gym instructor mentioned how impressed he was with her recent improvement in flexibility and strength, despite the fact that Amanda had been too busy with work to attend classes for over a month. Most chilling of all, Amanda discovered that someone had been using her name to volunteer at a local animal shelter, something Amanda had always wanted to do but never found time for. When she called the shelter to inquire about volunteer opportunities, the coordinator was confused, insisting that Amanda had already been volunteering there for months and was one of their most dedicated helpers. The coordinator described Amanda's volunteer work in detail, mentioning specific animals Amanda had supposedly worked with and particular skills she had demonstrated. When Amanda explained that there must be some mistake, the coordinator became defensive, insisting they knew Amanda well and had her contact information and emergency contacts on file, all of which matched Amanda's actual details perfectly. Amanda's doppelganger seemed to be living the life that Amanda wished she had time for, engaging in activities and pursuing interests that Amanda had always put off due to work and other obligations. This other version of herself appeared to be more social, more adventurous, and more fulfilled than Amanda felt in her actual life. The situation reached a crisis point when Amanda received a call from her mother, who was worried because Amanda hadn't returned her calls from the previous weekend. According to her mother, they had made plans to have brunch together, but Amanda had never shown up. Her mother had tried calling and texting but received no response. Amanda had no memory of making these plans and had spent that weekend alone in her apartment, just recovering from a difficult work week. When Amanda checked her phone, she found text messages she didn't remember sending, confirming brunch plans and apologizing for a last-minute emergency that would prevent her from attending. The messages were sent from her phone, using her typical texting style and vocabulary, but Amanda had no memory of composing or sending them. These 5 encounters represent just a small fraction of documented doppelganger experiences that occur around the world every year. And, while skeptics might explain them away as cases of mistaken identity, psychological phenomena, or maybe even elaborate hoaxes, the people who lived through these experiences remain convinced that they encountered something beyond normal explanation. What makes these stories particularly unsettling is how the doppelgangers seem to possess intimate knowledge of their originals, knowing personal details, behavioral patterns, and preferences that would be impossible for a stranger to fake. They appeared to be living parallel lives, making different choices but maintaining the core essence of the people they duplicated. Some researchers theorize that doppelganger encounters might be glimpses into parallel dimensions or alternate timelines, where slightly different versions of ourselves exist and occasionally bleed through into our reality. Others suggest they might be manifestations of our subconscious minds, projecting idealized or alternative versions of ourselves into the world around us. Whatever the explanation, these encounters serve as a reminder that reality might be far more complex and mysterious than we typically assume. They challenge our understanding of identity, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. In a world where we often feel isolated and unique in our experiences, doppelganger encounters suggest that somewhere out there, another version of ourselves might be living a completely different life, making different choices, and perhaps wondering about the roads not taken. The next time you catch a glimpse of someone who looks familiar in a crowd, or hear someone describe an encounter with you that you don't remember, you might want to consider the possibility that you've had a brief intersection with one of these mysterious doubles. And if you ever find yourself face to face with an exact copy of yourself, remember the experiences of Sarah, Michael, Rebecca, David, and Amanda. Sometimes the most unsettling encounters are the ones that feel impossibly familiar.